Okay, so what we're going to do is we are going to, in ideally under 10 minutes, we're going to review this fantastic poem, Exposure by Wilfred Owen, in terms of 5 really important annotations that we can get. Then we're going to layer in some of that all-important context. And then hopefully we've got a really kind of nice, clear, sort of potted version of the poem that we can apply to our revision. So let's go. The acronym that I used to get on with my annotations, and this is the same with unseen poetry, by the way, is FIRST. Now, FIRST covers 5 things that you're going to find in any poem that you come across, and therefore gives you a really good foundation for talking about any poem. The acronym stands for F, first and last line, I, imagery, R, repetition, S for structure, and T for title. Okay, so what I'm going to do first is I'm just going to identify the annotations that I'm going to make. Which quotes am I going to be picking out? Okay, so here is my first line, and here is my last line. I'm actually going to do my last sentence. Okay, so there I'm just going to label that F. Then I'm going to find one piece of imagery. Now, the imagery can literally be from anywhere, and there's no particular thing that you need to be looking for. I'm going to go with Dawn massing her in the east, her melancholy army attacks once more in ranks on shivering ranks of grey. Okay, because I think it's a really nice piece of imagery. I also want to focus on a couple of key words in there that stand out to me. Okay, then I'm going to look for any repetition. Now, repetition is quite easy in this poem because we have a refrain, but nothing happens, but nothing happens, but nothing happens, but nothing happens. Okay, so we have it 4 times in the poem, so it's a really nice, easy piece of repetition to be working with. Okay, so I'm going to put my my R for repetition there. In terms of structure, one thing that I notice is there's a bit of a motif development. We have, is it that we are dying, becomes we turn back to our dying, becomes for love of God seems dying. Okay, so this kind of relationship between the different the development of the motif here of dying is going to be where I comment on structure. And then finally, although it's the first thing that we come across, I'm of course going to identify my T, which is the title, exposure. Okay, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go straight into putting a bit of annotation down from those 5 things. And once I've done that, I've got a really lovely overview of the poem as a whole without really needing to go into extreme detail. Okay, so exposure, I want to comment on the polysemy of that. Polysemy is where you have multiple possible meanings deliberately there. And the polysemy is, of course, that we have, are we exposing a scandal? Is that kind of exposure? Or is it exposure to the elements? Both of those things are likely true. Okay, so it is a poem all about being exposed to the elements and kind of the effect of the awful weather on people's health, wearing them down through attrition. But equally, it is exposing the truth of what trench warfare is actually like. Okay, so really beautiful polysemy that we can take advantage of, and it is being set up straight away for us. Okay, now let's have a look at our first and last line. Okay, our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. Okay, now I almost never like people commenting on phonological features, so that's sound-based features. But this one is so on the nose that you can't really get away from it. The sibilance here is unmistakable, and it becomes kind of experiential. What do I mean by experiential? It sounds very much like it would if you were there. Merciless ice east winds that knife us. Okay, so that's sibilance, like the hissing sound of the winds. So it creates an experiential kind of impact. You are there with them. And it is obviously a very harsh opening. Okay, brains technically no, let's just be kind of really logical here. Your brain has no nerves in it. Okay, so if your brains ache, this is obviously metaphorical because there are no nerve endings in the brain. And if it is your brain that is aching, could this be to do with monotony? It is brain achingly dull and repetitive, right? Our brains ache, but also a suggestion as to the pain from the iced east winds that knife us, okay? And we've got our kind of personification there of the weather as a threat, okay? And that's kind of present all the way through. The weather is anthropomorphized. And we are not getting any threat. It is the weather, not weapons, that represent the threat to these soldiers. Okay? We compare that with the last line, but nothing happens. All their eyes are ice. So continuing with the threat of nature, of the weather rather, that kind of continues. But nothing happens. We get to see this sense of no progress. There has been no progress since the start of the poem. Nothing has happened. Nothing happens even by the end of the poem. Okay, so there is our first comment. We can talk about the contrast between the start and the end. It maintains the threat of nature, but also maintains the sense of anticlimax. We've got a really clear sense of monotony, also the unpleasant experience of the weather, all the way through. Okay, then we can jump into our imagery. So dawn massing in the east, her melancholy army. Okay, so look at the language. Army, attacks, ranks and ranks. Okay, so it's military language. But once again, it is the weather, not weaponry. And that's really important because this is a theme all the way through. You're expecting a poem about war to cover violence and artillery fire and all of those sorts of things. We only get that briefly at the start of the next stanza, and they are less deadly than the air. Okay, so there's a really clear sense that the enemy is in fact the weather. Okay, and it's dawn massing in the east, her melancholy army. Okay, so once again we have that anthropomorphism of the weather. It is not only personified, but it is also personified as a threat. Okay. Then we can jump into our repetition. And our repetition, but nothing happens throughout. It's all about anticlimax, isn't it? Anticlimax and attrition. We are being worn down by the nothingness of all of this. It builds towards an expectation of things happening, but nothing happens. Nothing happens 4 times, okay? Then we can move on to our structure, and I'll comment on structure. Is it that we are dying? Okay, so there is a mild sense of hope there, because it might not be that they're dying. We turn back to our dying becomes habitual. It becomes a what's the word that I'm looking for? It becomes an obligation. We turn back to our dying like it is their job to be dying. And then love of God seems dying, loss of faith. So what we're having here is there's a bit of hope, and then it becomes accepted that they are just dying, and then they're also losing faith in God. So even after they die, they're not expecting to go to heaven. So the structure here, it's from bad to worse with the motif of dying, because each time dying comes up, it means something different, and it is moving from bad to worse in that sense. Okay, so that is our structural comment. We've already commented on the title. We have got, therefore, 5 really fabulous annotations on top of our poem before we even think about the context. So our context, something to bear in mind. We can layer this on. Wilfred Owen wrote this poem whilst hospitalized for PTSD, which they then called shell shock, given the context of World War I, where he met fellow war poet and anti-war activist Siegfried Sassoon, who encouraged Owen's poetry, which he did before returning to the front lines and tragically being killed in action a week before the war officially ended. So we've got his actual, his role he has been traumatized by the war and then encouraged to write poetry on it. So we can see that this is, of course, an anti-war poem, but it is also a very personal poem to someone who has gone through this level of trauma. And he has not been hospitalized for an injury, which ties in with the idea of the poem. There's no injury that is happening, no source of injury. He has been hospitalized because of the trauma, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, aka shell shock, which shows that what happens to these soldiers has very little to do with all of the all guns blazing action that you might expect from a poem like Charge of the Light Brigade. Okay, the bleakness and horror of this poem stood in direct contradiction to the pro-war propaganda circulating the country during the Great War, making it a deliberately political anti-establishment piece. Any poem which is negative about the war and the war experience, we can call a direct response to propaganda. Okay, so 2 nice bits of context to layer in, 5 lovely annotations, and 10 minutes spent on this poem. Hopefully you are now in a more confident place with it.